Okay. So, Dave, the book is called Death in a Shallow Pond, A Philosopher, a Drowning Child, and Strangers in Need. Why did you write it?
Why did I write it? Well, first, thanks for having me here, and it's great to see more people here than there were at the Tory Party conference. So, so I was looking for another book after Parfit, and I wrote to Peter Singer and said, how about I write your biography? And he said no. And, you know, in a way, I think I probably missed a bullet in a way. I mean, he's got a very interesting background, Peter Singer. He's probably the most famous philosopher alive now, and he was raised in Australia as the son of 2 refugees. All his 4 grandparents were killed in the Holocaust. He's a very, very controversial figure, of course, because of his writings about disability, because of what he writes about charity, and also he's the founder of the animal rights movement. But, you know, in a way, I think I missed a bullet, because I think there aren't that many interesting stories about Peter. I've just written this story about this book about Derek, and everybody I spoke to about Derek had a story. So I'd ring up somebody about who knew Derek, and they'd say, you know, have I told you about the time Derek took his trousers off at the seminar? And so there was nothing like that with Peter. So I think it would have been a hard book to write. And then, so when he said no, I thought, well, maybe I'll write a book about consequentialism. It's quite interesting writing a book about the history of consequentialism, which would have taken me from Bentham to Mill and Sidgwick and through to Parfit and Singer. And then I thought, oh God, that's going to take me years and years and years. That's very hard work. And then I thought I'd write just a biography of this one very famous thought experiment, along with the trolley problem, which I'd also written about. It's probably the most famous thought experiment in moral philosophy, and definitely the most influential. So that's why I wrote the book.
And what is it?
So the thought experiment goes something like this. It's written in 1971 by Peter Singer when he's in Oxford. He's arrived in Oxford on a scholarship, and he imagines that you're walking past a shallow pond. You hear the cries of a child. You look around to see whether there is a parent or a guardian. There's nobody else there. So it's you or nobody to save this child. You're about to wade in when you notice that you're wearing your most expensive brogues. And he asks a question which everybody thinks is ludicrous. It's obviously a rhetorical question. He says, should you worry about your shoes or should you worry about the child? And of course, everybody says, how stupid. Of course, you have to save the child rather than your shoes. And then Singer makes the very contentious leap and says that all of us are effectively walking past, all of us probably in this room today, everybody in the affluent West, is effectively walking past a shallow pond every day of their lives. We could each of us give money to a charity that could save a life. And if we fail to do that, we are in effect morally on a par with the person who worries about their shoes rather than worrying about the child in the pond. So that's the thought experiment.
And am I right? That thought experiment was published in 1971?
So no. So it's written in 1971. It's published in 1972. So moral philosophy is at quite an interesting stage. The first half of the 20th century had been dominated by the logical positivists. And the logical positivists believed that if a proposition was not true by definition, or if it wasn't testable, it was meaningless. And so statements about God, statements about aesthetics, statements about morality were effectively meaningless. And then you get World War II, the Holocaust, you get people like Philippa Foot who say that just can't be right. It can't be right that if I say something like Auschwitz was evil, that's a meaningless statement. But it takes another 20 years, really, before practical ethics, the kind of stuff that we study at Uehiro, really gets going. And it's really, there's a lot going on in the 60s. There's the Vietnam War. There's the civil rights movement. There's the rise of feminism. There were debates about abortion. There were debates about capital punishment. And all this stuff is going on. And philosophers think, well, we need to respond to this. We need to have something to say about this. And in 1971, they start a journal called Philosophy and Public Affairs. All philosophers will know about that journal, Philosophy and Public Affairs. As a response to thinking, well, we need to start talking about these events and these issues. And in that very first issue, there's an incredibly famous article, volume 1 of Philosophy and Public Affairs, about abortion, published by Judith Jarvis Thompson, about a famous violinist. I won't go into the details, but it's a very, very influential article. The second volume, there's a very famous article by a guy called Tom Nagel about war and massacre. And the third volume, Peter Singer's article appears. So he's asked by Ronald Dworkin, who is a famous philosopher of law who's at University College, Oxford, and is a colleague of Singer's. He's asked if he has any ideas for this journal. And at the time he writes it, there's the War of Liberation in what we now call Bangladesh, but which was East Pakistan. West Pakistan and East Pakistan are breaking up. Millions of people are crossing the border from what we now call Bangladesh into India. India can't cope. They say they need 300 million. The British government offer them 15 million, and Singer writes, they just invested 250 million in development of Concord. Singer thinks it's a completely inadequate response, and he was wondering what our obligations are to those people who are starving, moving from Bangladesh to India. So that's the background to the thought experiment.
And as you know, the history of the discussion of the thought experiment has often revolved around finding apparent disanalogies between the pond and the situation the developing world is in. Did Singer see any of those disanalogies at the beginning?
So he tackles right in the first article with several disanalogies. So he early on he points out that some people might say, well, the identity of the person in front of you. You can see you can see the face, and you can see the person. You don't know who you're helping on the other side of the world. And he says, well, that can't be. It might be psychologically relevant, but it can't be morally relevant. And then he says, well, obviously in the shallow pond case, the person is right next to you, whereas in the charity case, people in Bangladesh, those people are a couple of thousand miles away or whatever. He says, well, again, that might be psychologically relevant, and you can see how in evolutionary terms we might have developed to care about what's close to us and not have any consideration at all for people far away. He says, well, obviously that might be psychologically relevant, but again, morally, ethically, what difference can it make that these people are a long way away? And, indeed, nowadays, he was writing in the 1970s, but already globalization had begun, we have the capacity with the capability to help people on the other side of the world, which we wouldn't have done 150,000 years ago when our moral sensibility was being developed. So that argument makes no sense. It's a psychological disanalogy, but it's not a moral disanalogy. So he deals with some of those things. I look in the book at many more disanalogies that he doesn't address.
And the article in Philosophy and Public Affairs obviously would have had influence in philosophy departments, graduate schools, and so on. Did the arguments have much of an impact outside philosophy?
I would say none at all. Well, that's true of 99.9999999% of all philosophy articles. So that's not very surprising. So philosophers were very interested in it, and it was reproduced many times. And a guy called Peter Unger writes an interesting book about it 20 years later, where he takes the arguments even further and says our commitments are even greater than Peter Singer says they were. But it doesn't have any influence until really the beginning of the 21st century, when two young Oxford graduates, I've spotted at least one of them in the room today. I won't out him, he can out himself later. Two young Oxford graduates independently read Singer's article, Famine, Affluence and Morality, and decide it's very important and they ought to act upon it. And in 2009, they started a movement initially called Giving What We Can. It's part of what we now call the effective altruism movement. They spot something that Singer doesn't spot. So Singer was all about the altruism. The effective altruism has another word in it, effective. And what they spot, so there's Toby Ord and Will MacAskill. Toby's a stats man. He likes poring over spreadsheets and so on. And what he spotted was that some charities are just a lot more effective than other charities. Some charities are 1,000 times more effective than other charities. A middling charity is 100 times more effective than the best charities. So, I mean, the way I put it in the book, you can imagine that one charity would save a life for $5,000, and another charity might save a life for $500,000. If that's the case, then the person who gives $495,000 to the ineffective charity is doing less good than the person who gives $5,000 to the effective charity. So they start a movement called effective altruism, still going today, global movement. It's changed in various ways, but it's been very influential. So it's very unusual for a philosophy article, and it's partly, I think there wouldn't be a book if it didn't have this impact. It definitely breaches the walls of academia and has a huge impact in the world.
And what part did Sam Bankman-Fried play in the story?
Well, a rather unfortunate chapter in the history of effective altruism. So the EA guys early on spot that there were two ways. If you want to do good in the world, there are two ways you can achieve that. One is with your money, and the other is with your time. And they start an organization called 80,000 Hours. So 80,000 is roughly the number of hours they calculate that those of us, well, I've done about 79,000 of my 80,000 hours. You're an academic, so you've only done about 20,000, but
if that.
So they spot 80,000 hours is roughly the number of hours that you have in a career. And if you want to do good, you should use your time effectively. And so this organization advises on careers that you could do that would have a big and useful impact. And Will MacAskill, they get a lot of publicity for this. It's called earning to give. It's so very counterintuitive. They realize that instead of going to work in a charity shop, maybe you're better off going to work in a hedge fund, earning billions of pounds and giving your money away. Maybe that's the best thing you can do. So Sam Bankman-Fried, I think he's a student at MIT, I think, at the time. Will MacAskill meets him in Boston. Sam is thinking about what to do. Should he go and work in a charity? He's obviously a very clever bloke. Will suggests that he does this earning to give, that he goes and works in finance, makes a load of money, and gives his money away. And that's what he does. He goes and works in finance, then he starts up a cryptocurrency called FTX, and within an incredibly short amount of time, he's worth billions. I think he's worth 26 billion at his peak. And then within about a year and a half, he's worth nothing. Well, the New York Times had him, now he was done for fraud. The New York Times had him sharing a cell with Sean Diddy Coombs. I know I sound a bit like one of those judges who've never heard of the Beatles. I have no idea who Sean Diddy Coombs is. Absolutely no idea. Anyway, he says a cell with Sean Diddy Coombs. it's a disaster for the movement, really, because he's closely associated with the movement. He's the kind of wealthiest link with the movement. So it's very sort of bad for branding, very, it's quite a few years ago now, and I think the movement is recovering. But that was an unfortunate chapter.
And Singer's argument is obviously about why people should give. How much evidence is there on why people do give? And should Singer have adopted a different strategy, possibly?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Singer doesn't focus very much on that. So there's a mass of literature on what it is that persuades people to give, and I've got 2 chapters on that, and it's really, really fascinating stuff about why people give and what causes they give to. So there's one has to be a bit skeptical about many of these studies, because there's been a replication crisis in psychology, and lots of these studies haven't been replicated in psychology generally. But there are lots of very interesting studies in the psychology of charity. So a very famous one is what's called the single identifiable effect. So if you ask people, this is the classic case, if you ask people, should you give money to Mary, who is in desperate need, living in some African country, or should you? And so that's one case. Or the other case is they describe the country. They say 5 million people are dying in Mali or Zambia or whatever it is. Should you give money to this cause? So the first cause is much more effective than the second cause. And then they've tried to identify what that identity effect is. So in one study, they offer people some money. They're allowed to share it with with a kind of stranger that they know nothing about. And in one version, they're told that there's a bunch of strangers, and all you know about them is they have a number. So, and you're told that if you give a bit of your money away, it will go to number 46. And even just giving the number has an effect. So people are more likely to give if they can sort of realize there's an actual human being at the end of that. So there's just masses of literature. There were studies about on a leaflet whether you should have a smiley face or a sad face to extract the most amount of empathy. And the result of that study was that if people are closely associated with a charity already, then the smiley face works. If people are not linked to the charity in any way, then you want the sad face. Anyway, there's just a lot of literature. It's very, very interesting. So I write a lot about that. I don't think Singer, he covers it a little bit, but there's a question about whether the Singer thought experiment itself is enough to convince people. And fortunately, arguments do work as well. So if you put the shallow pond thought experiment to people, you can persuade them to give more.
So I mentioned one name already. Another name in the book is Angus Deaton, and that not the coke snorting TV star, but the Nobel Prize winning economist.
Yeah.
So what does he think?
So he was extremely helpful to me, and yeah, as far as I know, he doesn't snort coke. He's based at Princeton now. He won the Nobel Prize. He writes about development economics. He read the whole book. He commentated on the whole book. I imagine he definitely won't approve of the book because it's sympathetic to effective altruism, and he is not. So his big argument is that aid just doesn't work of any kind. He's quite difficult to pin down on this because it's not clear whether he thinks all aid is counterproductive or whether he believes that most aid is counterproductive, and even if some aid actually works, it's impossible to identify in advance what that aid is. So you're best not helping people at all. But his basic argument, I spoke to lots of development economists about these various topics, but he has the most extreme view. But his basic argument is that countries with aid are those who do worst. So China and India, who've got the least aid per capita, actually have grown quite healthily over the last few decades. Countries that have the most aid per capita have done have done very badly. Again, there's a chicken effect thing. It's not clear whether the reason they've got the most aid is that they're most in need. And he thinks that aid of all kinds breaks the relationship between the government, the state, and the citizen. And if NGOs step in and perform the functions of a state, that lets the government off the hook. And if you let the government off the hook, they're not accountable to the citizen. They can become corrupt. They can go off and fight wars. And it has all sorts of terrible effects. So in shallow pond terms, what he thinks is that aid, far from pulling the child out of the shallow pond, and people end up jumping into the shallow pond to get more aid, or they won't pull people out of the shallow pond because somebody else is going to do it. So that's his argument. I think it's very worth taking these arguments about aid very seriously. I do take them seriously, but I think he's far too extreme. It seems to me inconceivable that there aren't some targeted forms of charity that do far more good than bad. But he's a Nobel Prize winner and I'm not.
Thanks. Well, before we throw the floor open, one last question, Dave. Has Peter Singer read it?
Oh yeah, he's read the whole thing.
And what did he think?
Well, amazingly, he likes it. Yeah, he likes it. Yeah, so he sent me a very, very nice note about it. Yeah, he supported it throughout the book. He didn't want me to write a biography about him, but he was very happy that I wrote this book. He read everything. He made comments. I made a few mistakes. He corrected those. No, he's been very helpful.
Great. I mean, actually, I think last time Peter Singer spoke in Oxford, it was in this room. And I'm sorry to have to tell you, Dave, there are queues right up to St. Anne's. But,
one day.
Okay.